At dawn on February 17, 1944, a storm broke over the vast expanse of the Central Pacific, not a natural storm, but one of steel and fire. For 2 long years, Truk had stood as the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the Japanese combined fleet, a fortress dominating the Central Pacific. It served as the critical fortress protecting Japan's vital southern supply lines, the central hub through which every resource ship had to pass. Every ship carrying precious oil from Borneo or valuable rubber from Malaya had to navigate through or near Truk's protected waters. For 2 years, American military planners had feared Truk, carefully avoiding it and building their entire strategy around its supposed impregnability. They assumed that attacking Truk directly would be too dangerous, too costly in both ships and men to even consider seriously. Then, in just 48 hours, the powerful Task Force 58 arrived and systematically erased this legendary fortress from the strategic map. This is the story of Operation Hailstone, the daring raid that broke the back of Japanese naval power in the Central Pacific forever. It was the decisive strike that finally cleared the way to the Marianas Islands, to Saipan, and ultimately to the runways that would end the war. The fortress that had been considered untouchable for so long fell in less than 2 days of concentrated aerial attack. To truly understand what Operation Hailstone destroyed, we must first examine what Truk actually represented strategically. Not just the legend of impregnability that planners feared, but the actual military infrastructure built inside the protective reef. The lagoon itself was a magnificent accident of geology, a massive drowned volcanic caldera, measuring an incredible 40 miles across its entire diameter. It was perfectly enclosed by a protective barrier reef that created one of the world's largest and most ideal natural harbors. This natural harbor was so vast that it could comfortably shelter an entire fleet, and deep enough to anchor Japan's largest warships. The Japanese had recognized Truk's extraordinary strategic potential long before the war even began, seeing its value immediately. They began systematically developing it in 1939, construction continuing in phases as war approached ever closer. They carefully built facilities stage by stage, creating what would become the central hub for all Japanese naval operations in the region. By early 1944, Truk had evolved into a formidable military complex with 5 operational airfields ready for action. These 5 airfields together could simultaneously handle between 300 and 400 military aircraft of all types. In addition to these impressive airfields, there was also a dedicated seaplane base that extended Truk's operational reach even further. Extensive repair facilities had been constructed, capable of performing fleet-level maintenance on even the largest warships without needing to return to Japan. Fuel storage facilities held tens of thousands of tons of precious, refined petroleum, the lifeblood of any modern navy in wartime. Ammunition dumps, warehouses, and the full range of port infrastructure completed this impressive military complex. Yet what made Truk truly irreplaceable strategically was not any single element, but its unique position in the supply chain. It's at exactly halfway between Japan's home islands and the southern resource areas that the entire Japanese war economy completely depended upon. The oil fields of Borneo and the Dutch East Indies produced the precious fuel that kept Japan's warships and aircraft running. The rubber plantations and mineral mines of Malaya and the Philippines provided equally critical materials for manufacturing. Ships carrying this precious fuel north and vital supplies south all had to pass through or dangerously near Truk's waters. The large fleet tankers that kept Japan's warships operational across the Pacific were either based there or transited through regularly. When American submarines began aggressively targeting Japanese shipping in 1940 to 1943, Truk became even more essential. It became the critical staging point where convoys could safely assemble and then disperse under the protection of land-based fighter cover. Remove Truk from the strategic equation entirely, and that entire carefully constructed supply chain became dangerously exposed. The Japanese military understood this critical vulnerability perfectly well, and they had fortified Truk accordingly. They had built it up not just as a naval base, but as a powerful strategic choke point whose loss would be felt everywhere. The garrison was substantial, numbering approximately 7,500 elite Army troops, plus thousands more dedicated Navy personnel. These highly trained soldiers and sailors manned the airfields, operated the port facilities, and stood ready to defend the base against any attack. The anti-mine aircraft defenses were particularly impressive, including more than 40 major caliber anti-mine aircraft guns strategically positioned. There was, however, one critical weakness in these otherwise formidable defenses. The fire control radar was missing. That sophisticated radar system had been lost several months earlier when an American submarine sank the transport ship carrying it to Truk. In theory, those 5 airfields could have launched enough fighters to make any direct attack against Truk prohibitively expensive and bloody. But all of that theory depended entirely on one crucial factor: those Japanese fighters actually being in the air ready to fight when the attack came. Vice Admiral Mark MIT Scher's powerful Task Force 58 had already been at sea for weeks before Operation Hailstone even began. They had been busy conducting operations against the Marshall Islands, systematically dismantling the outer ring of Japan's defensive perimeter one at all at a time. By February of 1944, the Fast Carrier Task Force that MIT Scher commanded had evolved into something unprecedented. 9 mighty fleet and light carriers, 6 powerful new fast battleships, 10 heavy and light cruisers, and more than 20 destroyers. This incredible force could conduct sustained high-speed operations across thousands of miles of ocean and put over 500 combat aircraft in the air simultaneously. American shipyards and factories had been working tirelessly toward this moment for 2 full years, pouring out ships and aircraft at an incredible rate. What Admiral MIT Scher commanded in February 1940 represented the culmination of that massive industrial, effort and national commitment. The Japanese at Truk had actually seen the Americans coming, in a way, when Marine Corps PB-4Y reconnaissance aircraft overflew the lagoon. These overflights happened multiple times in the first days of February, and Japanese observers dutifully reported them up their chain of command. Admiral Kobayashi, the Japanese commander at Truk, knew perfectly well that the Americans were watching his base very carefully. What he didn't know, what Japanese defensive planning had never seriously considered, was just how much American carrier aviation had evolved. They couldn't believe that carrier aircraft could attack a place like Truk directly without first building up land-based air power in the region as they always had before. The intelligence that might have told him a massive carrier strike force was already within range simply wasn't available to him. He had put his aviators and his entire base on high alert, and he kept them on that knife edge of readiness for weeks on end. Then, after all those weeks of constant tension and waiting, he finally let his guard down just enough to let them relax briefly. He himself was completely exhausted after weeks of constant worry and vigilance, unable to maintain that impossible pace any longer. American carrier doctrine for attacking defended bases had been refined through 2 years of brutal combat into a specific, proven sequence. The critical first phase was always the fighter sweep, going in before the bombers to clear the skies of defending fighters. 72 powerful F6F Hellcat fighters lifted off from the carriers in the darkness before dawn on February 17th. They flew Truk at very low altitude, carefully staying below the effective ceiling of the Japanese early warning radar systems. The Japanese radar screens showed absolutely nothing, no sign of the massive formation of fighters heading straight for their base. No alarm was raised, no scramble order was sent out to the airfields. The base remained completely unaware of what was about to hit them. The Hellcats arrived right at dawn, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the lagoon and illuminate the airfields below them. What the Hellcat pilots discovered when they looked down on Truk's airfields was not an organized defense, but a base caught completely unprepared. Aircraft were sitting on the ramps exactly where they'd been parked the night before, not even dispersed or hidden in protective revetments. Ground crews were going about their normal morning routines, completely oblivious to the deadly fighters now circling overhead. Many pilots were still on shore leave from the previous night or having breakfast in the mess halls, nowhere near their aircraft. A few Japanese fighters that were already airborne when the Hellcats arrived were just those on routine patrol at that exact moment. There weren't many of them, and they were quickly, systematically shot down by the vastly superior Hellcat fighters. After clearing the skies of the few defending fighters, the Hellcats descended on the airfields to methodically destroy the parked aircraft on the ground. 30 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in those first few chaotic minutes of the fighters' sweep alone. The pilots who had been in the barracks or base facilities finally began running for their planes when they heard the shooting and explosions. Some actually reached their planes, but most never made it in time to matter, never had a chance to take off and join the fight. The Hellcats held every possible advantage altitude, position, and the superior training that 2 full years of combat rotation had produced. They used all 3 of these advantages with the methodical precision of men who had practiced this exact kind of engagement countless times. Within the very first hour of the attack, Japanese air strength over Truk had already been reduced to a tiny fraction of what it had been at midnight. The bomber formations that followed the fighter sweep arrived over a lagoon where anti-minus aircraft fire was still dangerous, but where no organized fighter defense remained at all. The first day's strike against Truk was carefully organized into 2 distinct, separate phases, each with its own specific targets and objectives. The first wave of the first day focused its attention entirely on the ships, anchored peacefully within the protective waters of Truk Lagoon. That protective barrier reef that had shielded them from enemy surface attack for so long now became a prison wall they could not escape. They could attempt to maneuver within the limited confines of the lagoon, but they could not exit it under heavy air attack. To escape, they would have to pass through one of the narrow entrance channels, and those were completely controlled by the American aircraft now swarming overhead. The light cruiser Katori was the first major warship to be caught in the open waters of the lagoon, hit repeatedly by both bombs and torpedoes. After multiple devastating hits, she finally rolled over and sank beneath the turquoise waters of the lagoon she had once helped protect. The light cruiser Naka attempted a daring escape through the southern entrance channel, but she never even came close to making it out. She was intercepted first by American torpedo bombers, and then finished off by the surface ships of the battleships Kreen M. I. T-Shire had placed outside. The destroyer Maikaze, which had been escorting the fleeing Naka, met the exact same fate at the hands of that same powerful surface force. For more destroyers joined this growing list of sunken warships before the first day's attacks were even complete. The submarine tenders that had been supporting Japanese submarine operations from Truk were also found at anchor and summarily destroyed. These were irreplaceable support vessels for the entire undersea campaign that Japan had been waging with such effectiveness against Allied shipping. Yet, as important and impressive as all these warships sinking were, the most strategically consequential losses of the first day were the large fleet tankers. By early 1944, Japan's entire ability to conduct any kind of meaningful naval operations was directly constrained by how much refined fuel oil they had available. American submarine operations had already been targeting their tanker traffic with steadily improving effectiveness for 2 full years. The tanker fleet that connected the southern oil fields to the Japanese fleet and to the home islands was being systematically destroyed. It was being reduced at a rate that Japan's shipbuilding industry simply couldn't even hope to match. Every single fleet tanker they still had was irreplaceable in an operational sense, not because they couldn't build more, but because they didn't have time. The 5 fleet tankers anchored in Truk Lagoon that fateful morning of February 17th represented a major fraction of their remaining capacity. They were not glamorous combatant vessels. They carried no impressive weaponry. They were just slow, essential, absolutely vital to everything else. Without those 5 fleet tankers, the battleships and carriers and cruisers of the combined fleet weren't weapons anymore. They were just expensive, stationary targets. By the end of February 17th, all 5 of those irreplaceable fleet tankers were on the bottom of Truk Lagoon, gone forever. The 17,000 tons of refined petroleum they had been carrying burned through the night and into the following morning, a massive, unstoppable fire. That fire served as a beacon for the second day's strikes, and as a terrible measure of just how much had been lost in just those first few hours. The full, terrible effect of those 5 tankers sinking wouldn't become visible for months, but when it did, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf 8 months later, it would change everything. The next day, Japanese naval forces were forced to sortie from completely separate ports, from Japan itself and from Linga Roads near Singapore, because there was no single base left where they could concentrate and refuel together. Truk had been that base, that perfect central hub, and now it was gone, its loss a wound that would never fully heal. That consequence played out across every remaining operation of the war. Every time their fleet tried to move, every time they tried to fight, they were constrained by the fuel that simply wasn't there anymore. Because the tankers that would have carried that lifeblood of oil were now resting on the bottom of a lagoon in the middle of the Pacific, gone forever. Another 17,000 tons of stored fuel oil in the shore facilities burned through that same night of February 17th and into the morning of February 18th. This fire was visible from the American ships outside the reef, a massive column of smoke rising so high it could be seen by aircraft flying 50 miles away. The ammunition dumps that caught fire and secondary explosions produced thunderous detonations that continued shaking the area all through that long, terrible night. The airfields hit in the second phase of the first day's strikes had their runways cratered and their remaining aircraft destroyed in their revetments. By dawn on February 18th, what the Japanese had built at Truk over 5 long years of development was functionally over as a military installation. Still, despite everything, the garrison fought back. The anti-minus aircraft guns that had survived continued firing at anything that came within range. Japanese aircraft that had been dispersed to satellite fields on the outer islands launched counter-minus attacks against the American fleet that night. Small groups of torpedo bombers probed through the darkness toward the carrier task groups waiting outside the reef. One of these determined groups found USS Intrepid, and a single torpedo struck her starboard quarter at 2100 hours on February 17th. 11 sailors were killed in that attack, and her steering was badly damaged, forcing Intrepid to withdraw from combat and not return until August. That Japanese torpedo pilot who scored that hit in the dark against a defended fleet, 12 hours after his base had been burning, he was still there, still fighting. He was the distillation of everything that made the Pacific War as long and as terrible and as costly as it was, even when the final outcome was no longer in any real doubt. By midday on February 18th, the second day's strike had finished the work that the first day had begun so thoroughly. If you want more incredible, detailed breakdowns of history's most decisive naval battles and turning points, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. I'm your naval history guide, and we'll dive deep into the most fascinating battles and campaigns of World War II in every single video.